All right, men, load up. We're moving out now. Keep your eyes peeled. The line is hot up ahead.
In the autumn of 1944, Dwight D. Eisenhower faced a decision that could fracture the Allied command: remove one of America's most aggressive generals, or risk losing control of the Western Front. George S. Patton had become a symbol of speed and victory. His Third Army moved faster than any force in Europe. German units collapsed in his path. Cities fell in rapid succession. But inside Allied headquarters, admiration was turning into concern. What worried Eisenhower was not Patton's success. It was the cost of it. Supply lines were stretched across hundreds of miles. Fuel reserves were unstable. Coordination between Allied armies was weakening. Reports began to arrive describing diverted resources, improvised advances, and a commander who believed momentum mattered more than restraint. Patton saw hesitation as weakness. Eisenhower saw a growing strategic risk. Then came an order, a critical instruction meant to stabilize the front. It was clear, it was direct, and it was not fully obeyed. That moment forced Eisenhower to confront a question he had tried to avoid. Was Patton still an asset, or had he become a liability? What followed would test not only their relationship, but the stability of the entire Allied advance in 1944. By late summer 1944, the Allied advance across France appeared unstoppable. After the breakout from Normandy, German defenses collapsed with surprising speed. The Third Army under General George S. Patton surged eastward, liberating towns and capturing thousands of prisoners. Newspapers praised him as the most aggressive commander in Europe. To many Americans, Patton represented momentum, courage, and relentless offensive spirit. The war in the West seemed to be accelerating toward a decisive conclusion. But inside Allied headquarters, the atmosphere was far more cautious. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower understood something the public did not. Victory created new problems. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Railroads had been destroyed. Ports were overloaded. Fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements had to travel hundreds of miles along damaged roads. Every Allied army demanded priority. Montgomery required resources in the north. Bradley needed stability in the center, and Patton demanded speed above all else. What began as a strategic disagreement slowly evolved into tension. Eisenhower believed coordination and logistics would determine the outcome of the war. Patton believed hesitation would give the German army time to recover. When a critical order was issued to stabilize the front, it was meant to preserve balance between ambition and discipline. Instead, it exposed a deeper fracture between two powerful commanders. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from, your city and country. I read every comment, and it's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's examine the order that changed the relationship between Eisenhower and Patton in 1944. As the Third Army advanced across eastern France, momentum became both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. Patton's doctrine was simple: attack relentlessly, exploit weakness, and never allow the enemy time to reorganize. In August and early September 1944, that approach seemed vindicated. German forces were retreating in disarray. Entire formations surrendered without coordinated resistance. Bridges were seized before demolition charges could be set. Roads filled with abandoned enemy equipment. To observers on the ground, it appeared that nothing could stop the advance. But at Allied headquarters, maps told a more complicated story. The deeper Patton pushed, the longer and thinner his supply lines became. Fuel depots remained far behind the front. Damaged rail networks limited resupply efficiency. Convoys moved day and night along overcrowded roads, vulnerable to delay and disruption. Eisenhower and his senior staff saw the strain building beneath the surface of apparent success. What looked like unstoppable momentum also looked increasingly fragile. Eisenhower's responsibility extended beyond any single army. He had to maintain balance across the entire Western Front. British forces under Field Marshal Montgomery were preparing operations in the north. General Omar Bradley needed stability in central sectors. Every commander believed his advance was decisive. Resources, however, were finite. Fuel allocations became a source of tension. Ammunition deliveries required prioritization. Strategic coordination demanded restraint, not impulse. Patton saw the situation differently. In his view, speed was protection. The faster his army moved, the less opportunity the Germans would have to mount an effective counterattack. He believed that hesitation, not overextension, posed the real danger. Each pause allowed the enemy to regroup. Each delay risked prolonging the war. Patton had built his career on aggressive maneuver, and he was not inclined to slow down just as the enemy appeared vulnerable. It was within this atmosphere of competing philosophies that the first serious disagreement emerged. Eisenhower began issuing directives emphasizing consolidation and coordination. Patton, publicly compliant, privately resisted the spirit of those instructions. The disagreement was no longer theoretical. It was becoming operational. Beneath the appearance of unity, two fundamentally different visions of how to win the war were beginning to collide, and neither commander was prepared to concede easily. By early September 1944, the rapid Allied advance had created a logistical dilemma few had anticipated. German defenses in France had collapsed faster than planners expected, and the Allied supply system had not been designed for such speed. Fuel became the most critical resource. Every armored division depended on it. Without gasoline, tanks were little more than steel monuments. Eisenhower understood that momentum without logistics was illusion. So he issued a directive intended to restore balance, consolidate positions, stabilize supply lines, and coordinate future offensives across the front. The order was clear. No single army would receive unlimited priority. Advances would be measured. Resources would be distributed according to broader strategic needs. The Western Front would move forward as a coordinated system, not as competing thrusts. Eisenhower believed this approach would prevent overextension and protect against potential German counterattacks. In his view, discipline now would ensure victory later. Patton interpreted the directive differently. To him, consolidation meant delay. Delay meant opportunity for the enemy. He argued that German forces were on the brink of collapse and that decisive pressure could end the war sooner. Waiting for perfect logistics, in his mind, was unnecessary caution. While he did not openly defy Eisenhower, he began pushing the boundaries of compliance. Requests for additional fuel were intensified. Operational plans were drafted that assumed continued forward movement. Units were positioned for attacks rather than defensive consolidation. Reports soon reached Allied headquarters suggesting that Patton's forces were advancing faster than intended under the new directive. Fuel allocations were being stretched. Supply officers described immense strain. Eisenhower began to question whether the spirit of his order was being honored. What troubled him was not simply speed, it was control. A unified command structure depended on trust and coordination. If one army operated beyond agreed limits, the entire strategic framework could fracture. The tension escalated when Patton pressed for immediate operations against heavily fortified positions near Metz. Eisenhower had envisioned a more deliberate approach, one supported by stabilized logistics and coordinated planning.
There's no alternative.
Patton's insistence signaled something deeper than disagreement. It suggested that momentum, in his view, outweighed centralized authority. For Eisenhower, this was the turning point. The issue was no longer about fuel or territory. It was about command. And for the first time, He began to consider whether
We
his
must hold
most
this
aggressive
position at all
general was
costs.
drifting beyond the bounds of
But the
acceptable
Panzer divisions
risk.
are advanced.
By mid-September
must hold this
1944,
line, Colonel.
the disagreement between Eisenhower and Patton had moved beyond tactical interpretation. It had become a
losses have
matter
been
of command
significant in this
authority.
sector.
Reports
Yes,
from
but we
logistics
cannot afford
officers
to yield
painted a
any more
troubling
ground.
picture. Fuel shortages were no longer hypothetical risks. They were operational constraints. Artillery units were rationing ammunition. Armored formations paused not by design, but by necessity. Eisenhower began receiving briefings that suggested the Third Army's pace was exceeding what the supply network could reliably sustain. Behind closed doors, discussions grew more serious. Senior staff officers debated the implications of continued overextension. General Omar Bradley, who had long understood Patton's temperament, found himself navigating between loyalty and caution. He admired Patton's aggression, but recognized the structural strain it imposed. Eisenhower's concern was not emotional, it was institutional. Allied command functioned on coordination, balance, and trust. If one commander operated independently of agreed priorities, the entire front risked imbalance. The prospect of removing Patton was not raised lightly. He was one of the most experienced and aggressive field commanders the Allies possessed. His reputation inspired troops. His speed had contributed significantly to the collapse of German resistance in France. But leadership at that level required more than momentum. It required discipline within a coalition framework. Eisenhower understood that dismissing Patton could create political backlash and morale complications, yet allowing unchecked autonomy carried its own dangers. The situation reached a quiet climax during internal strategy meetings in late September. Eisenhower reviewed maps showing extended supply lines and vulnerable flanks. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces, though weakened, were reorganizing defensively. If a coordinated counterattack struck an overextended sector, the consequences could be severe. Eisenhower did not view Patton as reckless in temperament alone. He feared that the system itself could fracture under uncoordinated speed. For the first time, Eisenhower seriously contemplated limiting Patton's operational freedom in a way that signaled diminished trust. It was not yet removal, but it was a warning. The relationship between Supreme Commander and Field General had shifted. No longer was Patton simply the aggressive spearhead of the Allied advance. In Eisenhower's eyes, he had become a commander who required containment. The fracture was now visible, and its consequences would shape the remainder of the 1944 campaign. In late September and early October 1944, Eisenhower moved carefully but decisively. He did not remove Patton from command. Instead, he tightened the framework around him. Fuel allocations were centralized. Operational approvals became more structured. Coordination between Army groups was reinforced. The message was clear, even if it was never publicly dramatic. Speed would no longer outrun structure. The Allied advance would proceed as a system, not as a race. Patton, though outwardly compliant, understood the shift. His autonomy was no longer absolute. Orders required closer synchronization with overall strategy. Attacks would be supported by confirmed logistics, not optimism. Eisenhower had not broken him, but he had constrained him. The relationship between the two men settled into a new equilibrium, one defined less by trust in instinct and more by enforcement of balance. It was a necessary recalibration. The consequences of this recalibration soon became evident. As German resistance hardened around fortified positions such as Metz, the limits of speed without preparation were exposed. Progress slowed. Casualties increased. The terrain favored defense over maneuver. Yet because Eisenhower had reasserted control over supply distribution and coordination, collapse was avoided. The Third Army endured strain, but it did not disintegrate. What could have become systemic failure remained contained. Then came December 1944 and the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. In an ironic twist, Patton's aggressive instincts once again became essential. When American forces were encircled at Bastogne, it was Patton who pivoted his army north under brutal winter conditions. But this time, the maneuver was supported by logistics and coordinated authority. The speed was no longer isolated. It was integrated. The earlier conflict had not eliminated Patton's aggression. It had disciplined it. The order that had once strained their relationship ultimately reshaped it. Eisenhower did not turn against Patton out of rivalry or ego. He acted out of responsibility to the entire front. And Patton, whether he admitted it or not, operated more effectively within defined limits. The episode revealed a fundamental truth about coalition warfare. Brilliance without structure courts disaster, but structure without boldness courts stagnation. In 1944, the balance between those forces determined whether the Allied advance would fracture or endure. In 1944, the conflict between Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton was never simply about one order. It was about responsibility versus instinct. Eisenhower carried the weight of an entire coalition. He had to think in terms of systems, balance, and long-term stability. Patton thought in terms of speed, pressure, and decisive action. Both men were essential to victory, but only if they operated within the same strategic framework. The order that strained their relationship did not destroy Patton's command. Instead, it forced a recalibration. It reminded Allied leadership that momentum without logistics is fragile, and aggression without coordination is dangerous. In the end, the Western Front did not collapse because boldness was disciplined before it became chaos. The line between genius and liability proved thinner than history often remembers. If you enjoy deep military analysis like this, examining not just battles, but the decisions behind them, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments, which World War II commander should we analyze next? Because sometimes the most decisive moments of war happen not on the battlefield, but inside the command room.